So we are getting near the end of our series on the 10 words. And again, for anyone who hasn't remembered or been here, these are what we typically know as the 10 commandments. And really, when we begin to look at it, it is the message that God is giving to the people in connection with the covenants and basically preceding the covenant He's about to make with them, which has all the other laws that we typically know. But this is basically an understanding of what it looks like to be in relationship to God and to one another. And as we've gone through this, we've seen that it's not just some of them do each of that, but each and every one of them relates to that in one way or another. And we are currently on the 9th one, which we're calling I Am Not a Liar. And again, as we go through this, we'll look deeper into this idea, how it goes through all of Scripture, and how we can really understand how we can take this into our own lives. And for anyone who doesn't know or remember, this one is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. That is the specific commandment, the word that we're dealing with, that God is giving to his people here about the idea of false witnessing. Now, when most people come to this, obviously we think about false witnessing, but many will go on and take it further to the point of lying, and hence the title that we have there. But I think there's more to it than just that. And we have to look at the idea of false witnessing itself and what even is happening there, because it's more than just lying. That's just a part of it that leads to the actual problem. But we'll also look at lying and how we can truly understand how that relates to the way that we live in this world and how we relate to one another in that process. And to begin to understand false witnessing, I think we first have to look at some of the effects of what's actually happening there. That in John chapter 9, we find this story where Jesus heals a man who was born blind. And prior to doing this, his disciples had asked him the question, whose sin was it? Was it the sin of the man or the sin of his parents that caused him to be born blind? And Jesus redirected them to the point that it wasn't either of those. It was so that Jesus could do what he was about to do to this man. And after that healing takes place, there's a controversy that happens, and the Pharisees and the other religious leaders come after him and are trying to figure out what's happening. And basically, it's the idea that they're to the point where they have rejected Jesus. Now they're just trying to find some way to discredit him. And so they're doing everything they can. And so we get to this point in the story where it says, therefore, the Jews did not trust concerning him that he was a blind one and received sight, as far as which they summoned the parents of him, the one having received sight. And they asked them, saying, is this one your son, whom you yourselves say that he was born a blind one? Therefore, how is he currently seeing? Therefore his parents answered and said, we know that this one is our son, that he was born a blind one. But how he is now seeing we do not know. Or who opened his eyes we ourselves do not know. Ask him, he has maturity, he shall speak concerning himself. These things his parents said because they were fearing the Jews, for already the Jews had made an agreement in order that if anyone might profess him to be Christ, they might come to be expelled from the synagogue. On account of this, his parents said, he has maturity, ask him. Now, what again, the first part to recognize there was the fact that they were asking his parents, bringing them in, just so that they could try to determine whether or not this was actually a true thing that happened. Most likely they were wanting to prove that he wasn't actually born blind, and so the whole thing was just made up, so again, they could discredit Jesus. But when the parents come to him, they're stuck with this problem, that these Jewish leaders had already come to the point where if anyone was professing Jesus to be the Christ, they were being put out of the synagogues. Now, this might not sound like much of a thing, but for them, that was one of the worst possible things you could be imagined. It wasn't just that they couldn't come to the synagogue on a Saturday like we think we couldn't come to church on a Sunday, but it would destroy their entire lives. That no one among the Jews would be able to do business with them anymore, and and most Jews wouldn't want to do it with Gentiles, and so they were stuck in this place where they no longer do business or make money or keep their lives afloat, that it was akin to what I've often called social murder, that's the problem that is happening, is that their ultimate, that when false witnessing happens, that it's murdering a person's social life. And so that's kind of the idea here. This isn't a false witness story, but it has that same idea that these people are stuck with the decision of whether or not they can tell the truth based upon the fact that they could be put out of the synagogue if likely they knew that Jesus was the one who had healed it because their son had told him, and they didn't want to have to admit that for fear of this happening. And so they just turn it back and saying just to ask him. But this is the kind of thing that happens, that would have happened at this period of time, that Jesus being around if a false witness took place, is that if it was either something actually worthy of death, or it was something not necessarily worthy of death, but still of some kind of punishment to this degree where, again, their lives would be completely ruined because of it. One of the best stories we have of actual false witnessing is in the end of the Gospels, where we see Jesus being on trial. And in the Gospel of Mark, it says, "Yet in fact the high priest and the whole Sanhedrin were seeking a testimony against Jesus into the thing to put him to death, and they were not finding any. For many were falsely testifying against him, and the testimonies were not equal. And some, having stood up, were falsely testifying against him, saying, 'We ourselves heard him saying that I myself will break down this made by hands temple, and through 3 days I will build up another not made by hands.' And not even in this way was their testimony equal. And having stood up into the middle, the high priest asked Jesus, saying, 'Are you answering nothing what these ones are testifying against you?' Yet in fact he was being silent and did not answer anything. Again the high priest was asking him and says to him, 'Are you yourself the anointed one, the Son of the Blessed One?' Jesus said, 'I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting out of the rights of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' And the high priest, having torn his tunic, says, 'What need still are we of having witnesses? You heard the blasphemy. What is becoming visible to you?' And they all condemned him liable to be of death." And so, again, this is, we more or less know the story of Jesus before the Jewish leaders being on trial right before his death. And it brings up the fact that they had people coming forward to falsely testify against him because they had nothing to actually condemn him of. He had done nothing wrong in terms of the law or anything else. The only thing that could be said is what they come to at this very end of blasphemy. And obviously, if this were not Jesus, this would be the case. The problem is that they weren't willing to actually investigate if it were true whether or not Jesus were the Son of God. And him being God, this weren't actually blasphemy. And the reason for this is because they'd already condemned him. They'd already considered him worthy of death, and they were just trying to find some way to get rid of him, because the very fact of what he had done proved that he could not be God. Specifically to their own minds, a person couldn't perform miracles. They couldn't do these good things if they weren't sent from God. So the very story that we read earlier was proof enough that Jesus had come from God. The blind man himself gets into an argument with the Pharisees about this, trying to show them that reality. So the fact is, they had enough proof that Jesus was God, that he was sent from God, that if he was sent from God and he claims himself to be God, it has to be true via their own understanding and logic of things. Thus, they shouldn't have condemned him of blasphemy because he was actually telling the truth. But this is the kind of thing where we see this false witnessing taking place, and here it actually condemns Jesus to death. And again, that is often the way that false witnessing happens, is it will actually condemn a person to death. especially in their times. Today, we can have other things where there's just prison and other stuff, but for them, it was mostly death, or it was, again, the idea I pointed out earlier of socially murdering someone to the point where they may actually end up dead because of it, or if not, it's going to be a very miserable life that's not even really worth living at that point. And so that's the idea of what we see as false witnessing. Again, there are other examples, kind of brought up one in the scripture I read in Acts where Paul had this happen to him constantly. The unbelieving Jews from a place would follow him to the next place he was and cause problems and stir it up, which is ultimately what happened when he ended up being arrested, where he ultimately goes to Rome. But it was a constant thing throughout his life where people were always stirring up people, causing problems for him, and there was false witnessing all over the place. And again, this is the problem we see throughout the Bible, is that it actually ruins these other people's lives. And again, the emphasis there is that it's a false witness. It's not a true witness, but it's actually a false witness, and that's the thing that's destroying these people's lives. But now we have to turn to the idea of how lying fits into all of this. And again, obviously, false witnessing would be lying. You have to lie in order to do that, but yet sometimes it seems that there might be more to this idea. Because we find in the Bible a story where lying actually happens. In the book of Joshua, we find the story says, "And the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, saying, 'Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land.' But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, 'Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. Now it happened when it was time to shut the gates at dark that the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them.' But she had brought them up to the roof and concealed them in the stalks of flax, which she had laid out in order on the roof." And this story, obviously, it ends with her accepting the spies that Joshua had sent out to spy out the city of Jericho. And when the people came, the leaders of the town came to her, she lied, saying that she had already sent the spies out, that they had already left, but in fact, she was actually hiding them. And what's interesting about this story specifically is that Rahab is mentioned twice in the New Testament. The first one we find in the book of Hebrews. It says, "By trust, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with the ones having been disobedient, having received the spies with peace." And we also find it in the book of James, where it says, "And likewise was not out of deeds even Rahab the prostitute justified, having received the messengers and having sent them out by another way." Both of these are found in places where the books are speaking about faith. And Hebrews 11 is considered the faith chapter, where there's a whole bunch of different people who are set up for the faith they have. And here in James, Rahab is set alongside Abraham as having faith and it being out of works, out of the things that happened. And it most specifically speaks about her sending the messengers out by another way, but it still carries the idea that she lied to accomplish this thing. And so we have to be careful of over-connecting the idea of lying and its problem. Again, obviously lying is in almost the majority of situations a problem, but we see other situations like during the Holocaust where Christians were lying about hiding Jews to keep them safe, that there comes a point where actually saving someone's life is actually helpful. The lying sometimes is what you have to do to accomplish that. And so again, this isn't me trying to say that there's no problem with lying, but we have to be careful about how we're looking at, how we're actually describing and thinking about these things. And I think the best place to understand this comes in Ephesians chapter 4, where it says, "Therefore, having laid aside the falsehood, keep speaking truth, each one with his neighbor, because we are part of one another." That very end there, that we are part of one another, really drives home this point that it's about relationship, that the problem with lying is when it is breaking a relationship. Now, like the story of the Holocaust, I'm pretty sure the Nazis had already broken relationships with all the people around there, that there wasn't a relationship to break by lying to them any longer. And so it was in that specific situation, when the relationship's not being broken, it's different. But when there is something to be broken, whether it's breaking your own relationship with another, your relationship with God, or breaking their relationship with God or another, that's when it becomes a problem. Because when you lie about the truth of God, or even not even lie, but hiding and not telling the truth the way it's supposed to be, because those kind of things break relationship, that's when it really becomes a problem. So I'm not saying this to say that lying is an okay thing to do. I'm saying that we need a better way of looking at and understanding maybe our definition of lying and what it is, that it has to do with that idea of breaking relationships. And that specifically is what false witnessing has to do with this. Is that, again, as I said, that the idea of social murder, it breaks relationships. Obviously, it breaks relationship with the one who's false witnessing against the other, but it also breaks relationships of that one who is being false witness against with other people around them. And we can see how this thing exists within our society today, that it doesn't take much to tear down one's reputation. That a few things that are said against that person, whether true or not, when most people aren't actually looking into it and it starts to spread, and then that person's reputation is completely ruined. And once that happens, it becomes extremely hard to actually get that any of those relationships back. It makes it harder for them to be able to restore themselves within the social realm. So again, it's social murder that may not be the death sentence that it was back then, but it does still completely destroy a person's life. It makes it harder. They have to do more to build it up. And so you're breaking your own relationship with them, but it's also breaking relationship with the people around. And so that's the real problem with this, is that when these relationships are being broken. So again, the problem when it comes to false witnessing is the lying itself, but the real problem is that lying breaks relationships with different people. That this is why it's said that God is not a liar, because he's the one who's upholding and building relationships, and this false witnessing, this lying, has that tendency to tear them down. And this even goes to the point of not just about telling the truth or not, but something like what, again, you also find in Ephesians chapter 4 about speaking the truth in love. There's a lot of people who take that sentence and basically change it in the way they perform it. It's not speaking the truth in love, it's speaking the truth is love. And obviously you can't love without the truth, but you can speak the truth without actually having love for another person. That when you're speaking for the point of tearing them down rather than building them up, even if it is the truth, you're actually accomplishing the same thing as false witnessing. You're still tearing that person down. You're still causing problems for them, even if the truth is being presented within it, because you're not actually trying to help them out in the process. You're actually using it for the sake of tearing them down. So it's not even truth versus falsehood. It's also the way in which we're using it, that whether or not it upholds or destroys relationships is another important part in this. And I think that's the most important thing to take out of it, is that we have to actually consider our motives and what our words and our language is actually doing, that it's not just about whether it's true or false or anything like that. It's about what it's actually accomplishing and what's happening as the consequences to these things. And so when God is saying this, when we understand God not to be a liar, it's because God upholds and he puts forward relationships. He builds them up rather than tears them down. And that is the real message that I think we need to hear in all of this.